All right. Good morning and welcome everyone. This is session B.4. The topic is Introduction to the CalTPA Cycles. My name is Pranam Bedi. I'm a consultant here with the Commission, and I will be facilitating this session. Let me start off by introducing our two presenters. So we have Amy Rising, who is the Director of Performance Assessment Policy and Development for the Commission, and she was introduced in this morning's session. And then we have Zoltan Sarda. He is new to the Commission in the Performance Assessment Division, having come from 10 years of experience in teacher development in public schools, charter schools, and most recently at a private school with campuses in New York City, Brazil, and China. His areas of expertise is with project-based learning strategies and student social-emotional development. Prior to that, he was an elementary classroom teacher for 21 years in the intermediate grades and in kindergarten and first grade. Zoltan is also a lifelong woodworker and finds his best thinking comes when he's got tools and wood in his hands. A nice benefit, as he comes away with better ideas and a tangible, usable product.
Okay, and could you make me a co-host?
Yes.
Thank you.
You are most welcome.
Good morning, everyone. Zoltan is going to be pulling up the PowerPoint that we're going to be walking you through today. And yes, before you ask, the PowerPoint will be available. It has been uploaded and you'll be able to access it after this presentation. So Zoltan, just go ahead and move into presentation mode. There you go.
Okay, there we go. We already covered these pieces. Okay.
We'll start with the agenda.
Okay. So today, good morning, everybody. Today, this session, we're going to do a high overview of the CalTPA cycles, both Cycle 1 and Cycle 2, looking at what the requirements are for those portions of we're going for what the program supports that are available for candidates, and then we will close with some time for questions.
Thank you. So we want to start by just reminding everyone, whether you're in preliminary teacher prep or whether you are working in induction to support our new teachers as they develop, that we have perfect alignment for the first time between the TPEs and the CSTP, the teaching performance expectations that are used to drive teacher development and teacher preparation programs, and the California standards for the teaching profession, which guide the work in induction. Just take a second and note that our TPEs and CSTP, we have 6 main domains and they are now perfectly aligned. They differ in their elements, and there are 45 elements in the teaching performance expectations that sit under each of the 6, a total of 45, and then many that sit under the CSTP. And I believe all of you also know that the CSTP right now is also being relooked at, refreshed, they're saying, to make sure that it really does align with all of the new aspects of teaching and learning that were tucked into the TPEs when they were adopted by the Commission back in 2017. So with that, let's move on. So we are all doing the same work, whether we're in preliminary programs or in induction. It's just that we need to make sure that we are developmentally appropriate for our teachers at whatever point in their development we come to work with them. There are a number of key features in the California Teaching Performance Assessment that we want to make sure you understand. This is the underlying theory of action behind the performance assessment work. So I want to start by letting you know that we have 2 instructional cycles that are done across time in a teacher preparation program. And in this case, in induction, if they come to you with the need to complete their CalTPA and they're using the Commission's model. Each of our instructional cycles follows 4 steps. They start with plan, move to teach and assess, reflect on their practice, and then apply what they've learned by coming through this hands-on performance assessment while they're engaged in practice with actual students. Our cycles focus on all students. And in Cycle 1 in particular, we're looking at an English learner, a student with identified needs, including gifted students and other underserved students who may have experienced some kind of trauma in or out of school, or have something about their performance in the classroom that catches your attention as a teacher. And we'll talk about that some more. But in each of these cycles, candidates are expected to be able to demonstrate that they support and work with all students. Both cycles are content specific in nature, one in the multiple subjects credential performance assessment. One cycle is focused on literacy, the other on mathematics. If you are a single subject candidate, you would focus your work in your content area. We do have the same number of cycles for both multiple subject candidates and single subject candidates, two instructional cycles. The cycles, as I said, are diagnostic, and they provide lots of very specific detail to candidates. So cycle 1 has 8 analytic rubrics. Each rubric has 5 levels. Cycle 2 has 9 analytic rubrics, again, providing that detail across those 5 levels of each of the rubrics to the candidate. It's formative because candidates do the cycles over time, completing cycle 1, submitting it for a score, receiving their scores back. And if they need additional coaching and support, then they receive that and resubmit cycle 1 before they move on to cycle 2. Finally, it is important to note that in both of the instructional cycles that candidates engage with, they need to video their teaching practice. And the way they do that is directed by the assessment guide, and it is specific. And candidates go into their video clips and annotate them so that they can demonstrate where their practice is. And they address 2 things in their annotation. They address what they're doing and why they're doing it. And of course, our instructional cycles, it was really important when we worked with the design team to make sure that these instructional cycles were asking candidates to collect and submit the natural harvest of being a teacher. So what are those things that teachers really do in the classroom? And that is the focus of these instructional cycles. Next slide, please. It is important to note that in cycle 2, educational technology is required. How are students using educational technology to advance their learning of content? In this redeveloped CalTPA from the prior model that was established 20 years ago in California, there is less emphasis on written evidence by the candidate, and they have choices along the way about how to submit their evidence. Integrated instruction is highly supported in these 2 cycles. So while one is focused on literacy and one is on math for elementary candidates, multiple subject candidates, they are asked and supported in doing integrated instruction. So how is it that in your math lesson you're pulling in the arts? How is it in your English lesson or literacy lesson that you're pulling in history, social science, for example, or science? So how are you integrating content in your instruction? And we want that instruction that they engage in and submit to be complex instruction. And finally, we've spoken about this before, but it is formative, doing 1 instructional cycle and then completing the second. Next slide, please.
Okay, so we're going to dive into both cycles. We'll look first at cycle 1 and then cycle 2. A couple of points. One, just to build on what Amy said previously, is that idea of a complex lesson. We understand that teaching is an imperfect art and science, and there are very few lessons that go perfectly, particularly with beginning teachers. And so I think one of the things to keep in mind is that we're really looking for how a teacher thinks about their instruction rather than executing a perfect lesson. And so getting into a more complex lesson gives them actually more to talk about in their analysis. So again, both cycles are structured around this idea of planning, thinking about the students in the room, teaching and assessing the outcomes of that lesson, reflecting on what happened, and then applying the learnings as they move forward. So diving into cycle 1, the idea of planning. So what candidates are going to be doing in this phase is that it really resembles, in some ways, the thing I like about this is it resembles the beginning of a school year where you're getting to know your students, or if you're beginning a new unit where you're doing some deep understanding of where your students are in their learning and their interests and that kind of thing, what their backgrounds are. So this is kind of the mode we want them to be in. So they're going to be gathering contextual information about the students' assets and learning needs. And again, with the focus on assets, as Mary said earlier, we want to build on what they know and can do as opposed to having that deficit mindset. They need to align that understanding of where their students are with the California standards. Candidates will, their work will not be passed if they're not using the California state standards, either for literacy or for math. What they need to do at that point is then to think about how does the lesson plan, do some descriptive writing about how the lesson plan addresses the learning needs of the students and is relevant to their interests and assets. And then write a commentary on the resources and materials that they're going to be using. In this table, and these tables are throughout all of the, through all the documentation for the candidates. On the right-hand side, this is what they're going to be submitting. And so this is like a checklist for them, just through that they need to have a written narrative about the students. They need to have the lesson plan. The lesson plan can be any format that they are using. So if it's a district lesson plan that they're going to use, or a lesson plan from their institution, or if they have something of their own, or on the website, there's also sample lesson plans that people can use, but they don't need to use those. Then there's a written narrative about the rationale, thinking about anticipating the lesson. Why am I doing this? How do these apply to both the standards and the students' assets and needs? And then a documentation of instructional resources. And the page limits are really, we really want students to be, or candidates to be adhering to those page limits. So let's see. So for the focus student, they're going to be choosing 3 students to be doing their writing about and writing the lesson plan for. Focus student number 1 is an English learner. We do get some questions from candidates at times that say that they don't have any designated English learners in their classrooms. They can select a student who has recently been FERPed or who is no longer a designated English learner. And if they don't have students that are in that realm, they can choose a student who maybe needs some support with academic language or some literacy around language development. The focus student number 2 is a student with a district mandated IEP 504 or GATE. And it needs to be designated by the district as well. So, and focus student number 3, in this student is I think we all have memories of students like these. They're the students that you wonder about when you go home at night. You know, the student who maybe is falling asleep in class, who maybe has some behavioral problems or behavioral issues that are not necessarily from some sort of diagnosis, but just something that's causing something to go on. So to be thinking about a student, those students who we always wonder about as we move through the year. Okay, so step 2, and I know I'm going quickly here. We will have time for questions right after this session or this part. The teaching and assessing piece. So they're going to be teaching the planned literacy or math lesson, and then they're going to be recording it. They're going to be selecting 3 video clips of up to 5 minutes each. It's really imperative that the candidates record the entire lesson so that they can then pull those different clips from the full lesson. A full lesson is full of rich moments, but to think about you're recording one specific aspect of the lesson, you might lose something that you would really want to use later. And then as they submit these, they're going to be on the submission site, they're going to be annotating those video clips. And to think about how they're creating that positive learning environment, how they're setting expectations for learning, how they're engaging students in higher order thinking, and monitoring for student understanding. Next piece is as a reflection. Again, the goal of these TPAs is to really reflective practitioners, thinking about writing what happened, what did you learn about what happened. And again, as I said earlier, a complex lesson is really going to yield much more evidence in this part for a teacher to reflect on. If you're choosing something that's sort of assures success, but is not very complex, it's going to be difficult to respond to this reflection point. And then a key piece of this is to tie that reflection to specific evidence from their step 1 or step 2. If the reflection is not tied to step 1 and step 2, it's not going to be scored well. So it's really thinking about what did they plan, what happened in the lesson, and what did they learn from this experience with students. And then finally, step 4 is to apply. They're going to be thinking about if they were to do what would be the next steps, if they were going to continue this series of lessons with those students. Maybe they're going to reteach something. Maybe this lesson went in the process of a series of activities or within a unit. So what comes next is kind of the next piece that they're going to be thinking about on this work. They can write about this no more than 3 pages, but they also have the opportunity to do a video explanation if they want as well. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and we are open for questions.
So Poonam, do you want to guide us through? Are there questions in the chat? Or if anyone has a particular question about Cycle 1, we'd be happy to take it. So yeah, Poonam, let's start with you. Why don't you take us through the chat? I did answer some, but we're happy to elaborate.
Yes, Amy, I believe that you just answered a question that came up from Emily Richards. So her question was, will the video release the candidates give to parents to sign be updated to reflect the current online environment in Zoom teaching, or do induction programs need to create this?
Yeah, so that is a really great question, and it is so important when our candidates are video recording their practice that they make sure in advance that they have permissions in place for students and any adults that might be captured in those videos. Now, permissions are up to districts, and as we found as we moved into COVID and moved quickly into COVID, districts across the state all faced questions about video and video recording as we moved into online settings. And so it is up to every district to establish their own policy and guidelines. So what is very important here as induction supporters to candidates who need to finish a TPA, whether it's the commission's model or EdTPA or any model, Fresno's model, you do need to have permissions in place. They remain at the school site, at the district, and it's up to the candidate to check and make sure that there are, in fact, permissions in place. If permissions are not in place for a student, they may not be in the video. So I hope that helps answer that question. This is all laid out in the assessment guide that the candidate receives when they engage in the work, by the way. Other questions?
Early on, I'm Marianne from North Coast Limited. Thank you for your presentation. Earlier on, somebody mentioned that they do not need to have everything written. The responses don't all be written. I get the narrative piece, the reflective piece. So would in the planning stage, would some of that evidence be their lesson plans that they would upload that include the number of pages? I don't remember what that number was on the slide. Is that true? That would count as one of their pages?
Yes. So again, great question. And if we really, because we only have 50 minutes with you, we're going to have to stay at a fairly high level. But once we finish this session, we will tell you how to go get the assessment guide. And the assessment guide will walk you through every single step. These are, around 30-page documents that spell it all out. And the charts that Zoltan just took you through are part of that assessment guide, along with a written narrative to the candidate about what they need to do.
Got it.
So in step 1, the candidate is asked to write to us following prompts about the context in which they're teaching and identify 3 focus students. Mm-hmm. Then they're asked to submit a lesson plan, and the lesson plan can be hopefully the district's lesson plan, right, that they're using, or their institution of higher ed's program. If they don't have one, we have an optional one for them to consider. So there's a written narrative, there's their own lesson plan that they upload. Then there is a set of questions again, which is a written narrative about why they're doing what they're doing, the rationale for all their instructional choices. And then there's their resources, which they also upload. And each one of those 4 things, except for the lesson plan, has a specific number of pages. The lesson plan can be as long as the candidate wants it to be. All of that gets uploaded for step 1 and submitted.
Got it. And that's what those pages are that are on your chart on the right. That's what I was trying to decide. Got it. Yes. Thank you. That's very clear.
You're so welcome. And we had to put a page limit on because assessors, couldn't read for hours, right? And some teachers really love to share their work, which is exciting, but we needed them to dial it back a little after our field test. So we ended up putting some guidelines there. So what happens is if a candidate does have a document that's longer than the required page length, that's okay, they can submit it, but it will only, those first 9 pages will be read by the assessor, or only the first 10 pages, or only the first 3 pages, whatever the guideline is. So candidates just need to really pay attention and follow those guidelines so that they put all their good evidence within that required number of pages.
Perfect. I get it now. Thanks, Amy.
Thank you, Marianne.
I have a question.
Go ahead, Janine.
Yeah, this is really a dumb question, but I've been a coach for Placer County for 4 years, and this seems new to me. And I'd like to know how do you choose the candidates for this, or are all of our candidates going to be doing this?
Okay, that is a great question. So to clarify, when candidates left their program in the spring of 2020, in the middle of COVID, many of them did not finish their teaching performance assessment or tried and did not pass. So they leave their preliminary program and come into your induction program with the executive order preliminary credential. And on their credential, it says you still need to pass the teaching performance assessment. It is only those candidates that need to take and pass the teaching performance assessment.
Got it. Thank you.
You're welcome. So it's candidate by candidate. Let's take one more question, maybe. Any other questions about Cycle 1? So 1 class of students, 1 lesson plan, literacy or math if you're in multiple subjects. They teach it, they record it, they reflect on it, and then they talk to us about how they will apply it going forward. Hopefully that sounds useful. It sounds like teaching practice. It sounds like what we do as teachers. All right, well, just for the sake of time, let's go on and keep thinking about your questions. Do feel free to put them in the chat, and Poonam will help us with them. What we're going to do now is kind of take a deep breath and say, okay, that was Cycle 1. Each cycle is about 4 to 6 weeks of investigation for the candidate. So these are inquiry-based instructional cycles, right? So just talked about Cycle 1. Let's go on, and let's now talk about Cycle 2.
And my computer is a little frozen here, Amy, so hold on.
Okay, that's all right.
All right.
There we go. So Instructional Cycle 2 is called Assessment-Driven Instruction. And typically, Assessment Cycle 2 comes second in a candidate's experience, although it is up to the program and to candidates which order they want to do these in. But we highly recommend doing Cycle 1 first and passing it, then moving on to Cycle 2. So Cycle 2, again, has 4 steps: plan, teach, assess, reflect, and apply. So the first step in this cycle about classroom-based assessment, the candidate, again, is asked to give us contextual information about their class. And they could be teaching the same group of students. They could be teaching new students. And we know students come and go in our classes. So we didn't want to get anybody in the corner on this. So again, we asked the teacher candidate to tell us about the context. What are the assets of your students? What do they bring to this instruction? Now, in Cycle 2, candidates are asked to do a little bit more. It's a more comprehensive cycle of instruction than in Cycle 1. So in Cycle 2, candidates must identify and describe 3 to 5 lessons. That's their choice point. They can tell us about 3 lessons. They could tell us about 4 lessons, or they can tell us about 5 lessons. And these need to be lessons that come in order. So starting in Lesson 1 and moving through. Again, for that multiple subject candidate, if they did literacy in Cycle 1, then they will do mathematics in cycle 2. If they are a single subject candidate, they will do a different lesson, of course, although we do note with our candidates, we have to be very explicit, and we do say that. So whatever your lesson was in cycle 1, if you are, let's say, a chemistry single subject credential pursuer, then your content in cycle 1 will be different than your content in cycle 2, but it will both be about chemistry. And again, they must use the California Standards or Framework. So we provide links in the assessment guide that take them directly to the CDE website so they can get the California standards. They tell us what the standards are. They tell us how they will support their English learners by developing English language development goals. If they have ELD students in their classroom, they need to tell us what their English language development goals are. Then they're going to give us a description of the assessments. And in this cycle, they are going to engage in what we call informal assessment, all those things we do as teachers to check for understanding. They're going to have students engage in student self-assessment, where the student, using a rubric, will critique their own work. And then finally, a more formal assessment, a product, a process, or a performance that every student will engage in and complete. And then they're going to tell us about how, this is a very important point. This is a very important point. The candidate needs to tell us how their lessons link to prior learning. So these 3 lessons, or these 4 lessons, or these 5 lessons, how do they lead forward from what was priorly taught around the content? They'll tell us about their activities for students. And in cycle 2, somewhere in one of those lessons they tell us about, or in the assessments, they need to show us how students are using educational technology to further their content knowledge. That is, again, a choice point out for the candidate. They can do it anywhere, but they must do it at some point in these lessons. And then they're going to tell us about the instructional strategies they as the teacher will engage in. They're going to give us a description of language demands for the content they're teaching, because we're always about developing academic language. And then they're going to tell us if they need to make any adaptations or accommodations for their students based on their needs. So they have a learning segment template, we call it, where they give us sort of a bird's eye view of each of these 3 to 5 lessons. So they do, again, if you go all the way over to that right-hand column, you can see evidence to be submitted. So for step 1 for candidates, they need to give us the written narrative about the context. Who are my students? What assets do they have? What developmental needs do they have, etc.? What languages do they speak? And then they need to go on and complete their learning segment template. That allows them to tell us about each one of their lessons and the 3 types of assessment. They then provide a description of the assessments that they're going to be conducting and the rubric. So each type of assessment must have a rubric attached to it to show how the candidates will be meeting the learning goals. So you can see if here at the bottom, they're going to submit to us the informal assessment with a rubric. So let's say it's an exit card, and they're going to tell us how they're going to look for information from the candidates across a series of qualitative, responses from low to high around that exit card. And for their informal assessment, they're going to submit a copy of their student self-assessment and the rubric students will use to critique their own work. And then they will submit a copy of the formal assessment, and again, a rubric that the teacher candidate will use to assess the work. So let's go. So that's step 1. There's a lot going on in step 1. Now in step 2, remember, step 2 is always about getting up on your feet and teaching, and you're going to record all of your lessons. So whether it's 3, 4, or 5, you will record all of it, and then you will go back into your video recordings and you will pick out video clips. For cycle 2, step 2, there are 4 clips that candidates submit. And again, clips are up to 5 minutes, no more than 5 minutes. If they submit an 8-minute video, only the first 5 minutes will be reviewed by the assessor. The first clip is about instruction and assessment of academic language development. So where across these lessons and these assessments are you developing academic language? Show us, and in your annotation, tell us what you're doing and why you're doing it. The second clip is about students using ed tech. In this clip, this is the only clip in the whole experience where the teacher candidate does not need to be in the clip. The clip should be of students using ed tech to further their content knowledge. The third clip is around instruction and informal assessment of content. So where is all that checking for understanding? How is that going on during the instruction. And then the fourth clip is about seeing the student self-assessment and the teacher candidate modeling how to use student self-assessment. So they go in and annotate their 4 clips. Now, annotations have to be used at least once across the 4 clips, but can be used as many times as the candidate wants to show us explicitly where they're doing specific things. So where are they assessing student learning and development of academic language? Where are the students using ed tech? Where are they providing content-specific feedback to students? And finally, where are they assessing student learning and use of higher order thinking skills? So there are 2 key things that run across both of these instructional cycles, and that includes these 2 important things: the development of academic language around content and the use of higher order thinking as they're learning content. And then finally, at the end, they provide an analysis of what they learned from the informal assessment and the student self-assessment, and that's no more than 3 pages. So again, lots of work in step 2. That moves us to step 3. Yes, reflection in step 3. And here it is a little different than in cycle 1. So in step 3, cycle 2 on reflection, the candidate is going to take a close look at their formal assessment responses. And they are going to have kids engaged in developing products, processes, or engaging in performances. If students are building a product of some kind, then they can submit that. If it's a process, they may video record it to capture the student, for example, working through and talking out loud about solving a math equation. And then the third might be a performance as a type of assessment. So again, if the students are engaged in performance, let's say the whole series of lessons was about thinking through writing and then producing a puppet play, then we would want to see video clips of the students engaged in that puppet play. So in this steps, the teacher candidate must identify 3 student responses to the formal assessment: a student that exceeded the learning goal, a student that met the learning goal, and a student who has not yet met the learning goal. And they need to show us how they're providing feedback to the students based on the rubric that they're using for their formal assessment. Excuse me. So in this step, there are 2 items that need to be uploaded. So the formal assessment responses from the 3 students, so that's 3 things: 1, student exceeded, student who met, student who did not yet meet the learning goal, with feedback. And then there's a written narrative again, where they respond to prompts and they're providing an analysis of the assessment results and reflection. So what's important here is that the candidate is reflecting back on steps 1 and 2, planning and teaching and assessing. And they're looking at their informal assessment results. They're looking at the student self-assessment results, what the students understand about their own learning. And they're looking at the formal assessment. And across those multiple measures, the teacher candidate then determines either 1, I'm going to teach an extension lesson because all of my students have met the learning goals, or they're going to identify that, in fact, due to the data of the informal, the student self-assessment, and the formal, they're going to determine that the students have not yet met the learning goal, or a subgroup of students has not yet met the learning goal. And then when we get to step 4, go ahead, Zoltan. In step 4, candidates now have to actually provide an extension activity to move beyond where they came in those first lessons, or they're going to reteach, and they're going to reteach in a new way. Because we all know as teachers, just saying it louder or longer is not going to increase content knowledge. We need to shift our teaching and meet our students where they need to be met so that they can learn and access the content. So in this 4th step, in the past, candidates used to just write about what they would do, but we had no way of knowing whether they actually did it. So one of the design team in working with them a few years back was adamant that the teacher candidate needed to complete this instructional cycle by actually either reteaching in a new way the content for those students who had not yet met the learning goal, or they needed to provide that next step extension lesson to move them beyond because they in fact had met the learning goal. And so this is actually a 5th video clip in this step 4. And that brings us to the end of cycle 2. So let's go to questions first, and then we'll come back to supports. Perfect. Any questions we can take at this point? Again, Poonam, I'm going to ask you to jump in and see what we've got.
Yes. So we had a number of questions come in the chat. We have one from Susan Hall. The question is, whose responsibility is it now to let the commission know when the TPA has been passed? So in other words, who assures the commission, who assures that the commission has the information so that the induction program can clear the preliminary credential?
Okay, so that is a great question. For a teacher candidate who comes into induction, and needs to pass the CalTPA, they will register, they will complete, they will submit, and scores will be reported for them. The candidate will receive the score. You as the program will have a way to look up the score, and the commission receives the score. And we know if they've met. So in cycle 1, they must meet 19 points. They must gain 19 points across 8 5-point rubrics. So that's 19 points out of 35, sorry. And then in cycle 2, that's right, 40. In cycle 2, it's 9 5-point rubrics. And in cycle 2, they must reach 21 points out of 45. Okay, so 19 points to pass cycle 1, 21 points to pass cycle 2. And we will all know that on the same day. Candidates can submit their work every month of the year. There are submission windows. When a candidate submits their work, within 3 weeks, they will receive their score report. And on that day, the candidate receives the score, you will be able to look up the score, and we at the commission receive the score. Once the candidate has passed cycle 1 and cycle 2, they have that evidence and they can share it with you, and you are welcome to ask them for it. You will also have a way to look it up. When they complete their induction program, you are in the position of recommending them for a clear credential. And it is at that point that you want to check and make sure that they have in fact passed their TPA. Now, hopefully you know this because you've been supporting them all through the 2-year program, and they could pass it in their first year of the program. They could pass it by the end of their second year. Frankly, because they're on a preliminary credential, the credential is good for 5 years, right? So they actually have 5 years to pass, but we want them to be supported in this work. This is one of the things that we haven't gotten to talk too much about yet, but it is really important to understand that these are embedded performance assessments, and we expect you as coaches and directors to support candidates. What does that mean? It means reading their responses when you can, you should, providing those clarifying questions, asking critical questions to push their thinking, and letting them revise. You can also watch their videos. Peers can review each other's work. We want teacher candidates to know that we support each other in this profession, and the way we get to really great instruction and assessment is when we collaborate. Now, it is the teacher's own individual original work, and they sign an attestation saying that it is. So the notion here is that you practice, practice, practice. We give you models. There are posted models of candidate responses that you can look at, and you practice. And when you're ready and your performance is the best it can be, then you submit. And you sign that it is your own original work, and we do check work. So we know if we receive a narrative that like somebody's cousin wrote 2 years ago, we will see that, we will catch that. It doesn't happen very often, but the candidate is putting their credential on the line. So they do need to do their own original work, but we want them supported throughout the process.
Thank you, Emmy. There's a few follow-up questions in the chat very quickly from individuals asking how do programs access scores?
We're working on that. So right now, what you need to do to access the score is you need to talk to the candidate directly. And you only need to talk to the candidates where they have a credential that says they still need to complete the TPA. It will say that on their credential. You can all look up their credentials on the commission's website using the candidate's social security number. So you can get it directly from the candidate, and we are working with our contractor evaluation systems to be able to provide a lookup for you soon, where you can look up a candidate by their name and get their passing standards as results as well. But for now, in your work with candidates, you need to just directly talk to them and check their credential.
Perfect. Okay, we had another question. This one came in from Shannon Bowie. The question was, if the candidate completed cycle 1 in their credential program and is now hired, do they need to start over and do cycle 1 again in their new context as a hired teacher?
No. Great news. Once you pass a cycle, it's good for 10 years. It's good for 10 years. So once they pass it, it's passed. And then they move on to cycle 2. And that's the case for a lot of our candidates. They did get through cycle 1, And really they're coming to you and probably just have cycle 2.
Perfect. So we had another question came in from Kirsten Martin. I believe this was during the slide on step 1 of cycle 2. The question was, does the self-assessment need to come before the formal assessment?
No, it can come in any order the candidate would like to plug it into their series of lessons. But it should be rational. It should make sense. The second rubric, by the way, in cycle 2 really looks at alignment across the 3 to 5 lessons, alignment of the assessments, making sure that everything is aligned and orderly and progresses for the students. So that is something we do measure in the second rubric of cycle 2.
Okay, we had a question come in from Amanda Mulvey. The question was, does it need to be, or do the same focus students need to be used for both cycles?
No, so cycle 1 has focus students, cycle 2 does not have focus students. So Poonam, I know we're supposed to wrap up. So maybe just one more question, and I do want to be able to share the support slide with you. It's important for all of you to know we have lots and lots of supports ready and available for you, and we want to join you. We want to invite you to join us for them. So last question, and then we'll move on to our last slide. Get you on all off to your next session. Is there any other questions that we can answer at this time?
Okay, there's one question that came in. It says, in step 1, is there a required or preferred format for the rubrics used? For example, should they demonstrate that they can use a holistic or analytic rubric, or can they use single column rubric or unconventional types of rubrics?
Candidates, so one of the things you ran into early on is definitions of things. So there's a definition of rubric in the glossary. I suggest you read that. I also suggest you look at the posted candidate responses to see examples. But the rubrics we're talking about must be descriptive and qualitative, and start with the lower performance, describe the middle performances, describe the highest performance, all in relation to the learning goal. So whether it's a 3-level rubric, a 4-level rubric, a 5, it's up to the candidate to make those decisions.
Go on.
All right, so let's back up one slide and this is a really important website for you all to know and to write down and to go to, because when you go to ctcexams.nesinc.com, you'll come into the landing page and you'll choose CalTPA. That will take you into the CalTPA information for candidates as well as faculty. And if you go to the faculty set of resources, you will find all the information we've been talking about, the assessment guides themselves, the rubrics, the program guide, which is so important for you to read, and you will have access to the candidate submissions that we've posted. Now, you will have to have some additional information there. So once you go into the website, you can let us know if you need additional information and we'll share it with you. But this is where you're going to find all your resources for the CalTPA that we have posted at this time. So let's go to our last slide then, Zoltan.
Okay.
And one moment on this, because this is important in induction. As candidates come into your induction programs, you need to take them from where they are. And if they need to pass the TPA, and if they need to perhaps also pass RECA, or they need to pass one or the other, that's where you start with the candidate and their IDP, their individual development plan that comes from the preliminary program, should help you understand in induction what this candidate really needs to focus on. And when you build that ILP, that individual learning plan, this is where you're going to infuse it with the TPA work or RECA or whatever the needs are of that candidate, and it will become their induction program. And if they finish it up in the first year, you can go on and revise the ILP to include those goals of inquiry. So again, what we want to just keep remembering is we want to do just-in-time support, and we want to think about long-range professional practice. And then as they move through these obligations, they have to complete their preliminary for a clear that they couldn't complete in their program because of COVID. Then we'll move them along through that other rich in support that you offer in induction around an inquiry-based approach. So next slide, please. And again, just remember those renewal codes will be on their credentials, so do check those. And let's go ahead to our last slide around supports.
Okay, so finally, a lot of the questions asked, we also have opportunities for you to ask them ongoing. So we are holding weekly office hours for candidates. You can see they're meeting on Wednesdays, and then for induction Thursdays, and then for program, some of those questions that you're having about program questions are on Thursdays. We are holding monthly virtual think tanks as well. Which are really interesting. People sharing best practices and thinking about strategies to support candidates. We also have these quarterly coordinator meetings. Again, we are sharing this slide deck with you so you can refer to these dates and times. And then we also have the CTC YouTube channel where there's all kinds of videos and recordings of information sessions and just a huge list of resources for both candidates and for programs. And with that, we'll stop the share and say thank you to everybody for joining us, and we will see you in later sessions.
Thank you. And I do apologize that we've run out of time. We're not going to be able to get to some of your important questions, but do join us for office hours. We're live every week to support you, and we have lots of supports that are posted on our YouTube channel that will be helpful. And or just email us. We're here for you. Take care and have a great rest of your session. Thank you.
Thank you to